Horror story. Once there lived a young researcher named Liam, a quiet but fervent scholar, whose life's work was to seek and unravel the mysteries of the supernatural. He was fascinated by tales of haunted houses, eerie specters, and whispered legends. But of all the stories, one house had eluded him, a crumbling estate on the edge of a forgotten village, rumored to possess an elusive evil that defied any who sought to uncover its secrets. Locals said the house was alive, that it strained against itself, as if desperate to break free from something deep within. For years, Liam had heard about this house, spoken of in the occasional hushed voice among his colleagues, whispered like a warning. Many who dared approach its grounds felt a sensation they could only describe as the house breathing. Those who did go inside rarely spoke of it afterward, if they spoke at all. Each failed attempt from others had only increased Liam's resolve to uncover its truth. So, when he finally received a tip on the estate's exact location, he felt a jolt of anticipation. This would be his defining moment. Arriving in the village, he was greeted by silence. A dense fog hung low, blurring the edges of the world and swallowing any sound that might dare pierce it. Liam walked toward the house, his pulse quickening with both excitement and trepidation. Just as the estate loomed into view, a towering, decayed silhouette against the cloudy sky, a voice cracked the silence. "Son, please, don't go any further." He turned to find an elderly woman standing by the road, her face pale and her eyes wide with worry. She wore a thick shawl that looked as worn as she did, hands clasped tightly as though in prayer. "Thank you, ma'am, but I assure you," he replied with a calm smile, "I'm well versed in these matters. You needn't worry." Her hand shook as she reached out, grasping his sleeve. "It's not just a haunted house, you see. Different. This house doesn't want you to go in. It'll twist and turn, make you lose yourself, and then it'll take what it wants." But Liam was resolute. Gently, he freed himself from her grip and continued forward, feeling her gaze heavy on his back. He had heard such warnings before and dismissed them as local superstition. After all, he was a researcher. Skeptical, methodical, and, above all, rational. Yet, as he neared the front door of the house, a strange sensation crept over him. The air grew thick as though he were walking underwater, and a low groaning noise seemed to reverberate through the walls. With every step he felt a growing urge to turn back, an urge he stubbornly resisted. He stepped inside. The house was darker than he had anticipated. Only a thin, sickly light filtered in through cracked windows, casting elongated shadows that flickered as though alive. The air was stale, but there was something else, an undertone of rot and something sweetly sickening like spoiled fruit. As he moved deeper, he felt a sensation that sent a shiver down his spine. The house seemed to be shifting. Hallways twisted subtly when he wasn't looking, rooms appeared where none should be, and staircases spiraled downward where he'd seen none before. Each step took him further from the world outside and deeper into the house's maze-like innards. Then suddenly he heard it, a sound like bones creaking, wood splintering, and metal scraping. It was subtle at first, like the low rumble of thunder far off. But it grew louder with each passing second until it sounded as though the house itself were straining, bending, and cracking as if struggling against invisible chains. He remembered the old woman's words and felt a jolt of dread. Determined to prove his nerves wrong, he pushed forward, entering a small parlor filled with dust-covered furniture. In the center was a grand mirror, its surface strangely clean despite the dust and decay around it. The mirror's reflection, however, showed something else entirely, a room devoid of the debris that surrounded him. It was as though he were looking into a different time, a moment frozen in place. And then, as he stared, the reflection began to change. Faces began to appear, half-formed, translucent, flickering in and out as though caught between realities. Their eyes hollow, mouths open as if screaming. His own reflection wavered, contorting as though something in the mirror were trying to pull him in. Suddenly, the sensation of the house breaking, bending, straining reached a fever pitch. The walls around him began to tremble, and he stumbled backward, finally feeling the fear that had been building all along. The groans grew louder, more insistent, like a monstrous heartbeat. He realized, far too late, that the house was alive, not with any spirit he could exorcise or soothe, but with a consciousness that fed on those who dared challenge it. It was trying to consume him, twist him into its very foundation. Desperate, he turned, bolting through a hallway that seemed to close in on itself, the walls pressing closer with each step. He ran, following no particular path, only hoping for escape. Somehow, miraculously, he stumbled out the front door, tumbling onto the overgrown lawn. The house behind him seemed to settle, its groaning fading into silence, as if disappointed it had lost its prey. Breathless and shaken, Liam rose to his feet, glancing back one last time. The house stood as it had before, silent and unmoved, a looming reminder of the mistake he had made in underestimating it. From the shadows, the old woman watched him, her eyes knowing. "Son," she called softly, her voice a mere whisper on the wind, "some mysteries aren't meant to be solved." Without a word, he nodded, understanding now in a way he wished he never had. He turned and left, feeling the house's gaze on him as he walked away, knowing he'd never dare return to finish the investigation. The horror he sought had found him, marking him with a dread he would carry for the rest of his life. Liam didn't know how long he had been wandering within the house's endless hallways when he felt the floor give way beneath him. One moment he was standing on cracked wooden boards, trying to decipher the shifting shadows around him, and the next he was falling, his hands clawing for something, anything to break his descent. His stomach dropped as he tumbled into darkness, landing hard on a cold, unforgiving floor. Pain shot through his body as he lay there, dazed, his mind struggling to process what had happened. As he gathered himself, the faint sound that had haunted him since he'd first entered the house grew louder, a terrible, scraping groan that reverberated through the walls like the slow, agonized wail of a trapped soul. The sound was different down here, closer and more intense, as if it originated from somewhere deep within the basement where he now lay. Slowly, Liam pushed himself to his feet, shivering as the chill of the basement crept into his bones. His flashlight had slipped from his grip in the fall, but he soon found it, the small beam cutting weakly through the thick, oppressive darkness around him. He took a slow breath, trying to calm the rising panic that thudded against his chest. He had always prided himself on his ability to remain calm in the face of the supernatural, on his analytical mind that had saved him in countless situations. But now, for the first time, he felt an overwhelming dread, something primal that clawed at him from within. He was trapped. And whatever made that dreadful sound was down here with him. The room he had fallen into was small, cluttered with broken furniture and rusted tools, as though it had once served as a workshop or storage space. The air was thick with a pungent, metallic smell, and the walls were cold and damp, covered in a strange, pulsing mold that seemed to shimmer under his flashlight. The sound came again, a long, ragged groan that sent icy tendrils down his spine, louder now, emanating from somewhere further within the basement. He felt a strange compulsion to find its source, to understand the horror that lurked within these walls. His curiosity battled against his fear, and slowly he started walking, each step echoing in the silence, each footfall weighed with dread. The corridor ahead was narrow, lined with decaying bricks that oozed dampness, as though the house itself were weeping. The walls seemed to close in on him, making the space feel tighter with each step, as if trying to trap him within its depths. He forced himself to breathe slowly, gripping the flashlight tightly, letting its beam guide him forward. He couldn't afford to lose his nerve now. Whatever was making that sound, whatever was keeping him here, he had to face it. At the end of the corridor, he came upon a heavy iron door, its surface rusted and corroded with age. He hesitated, his hand trembling as he reached for the handle. The groaning sound was louder than ever, filling the small space like a living presence, pressing against him from all sides. He swallowed hard, feeling his heart hammer in his chest. He couldn't turn back now. With a final, steadying breath, he pulled the door open. A cold wind rushed out, smelling of rot and decay, and Liam instinctively took a step back. His flashlight illuminated the room beyond, casting its faint glow over a sight that chilled him to the core. In the center of the room stood a figure, a girl perhaps no older than 16, her skin as pale as bone, her thin frame draped in a tattered white dress that clung to her emaciated body. Her long black hair hung in limp strands, covering most of her face, but through the gaps he could see dark, hollow eyes that seemed to stare into nothing. A thick, rusted chain was fastened around her neck, its links snaking across the floor like a steel serpent, disappearing into the shadows behind her. For a brief moment she was still, the room silent except for the faint sound of her ragged breathing. Liam held his breath, his mind racing as he tried to make sense of the scene before him. She looked like something out of an old legend, a lost soul bound to this place by forces he couldn't comprehend. But as his flashlight fell upon her, her head turned slowly and her dark, haunted eyes locked onto him. A low growl escaped her lips, a sound filled with pain and fury, as though she had been waiting centuries for someone to witness her agony. Then, without warning, she let out a piercing scream, a sound that shattered the silence and reverberated through his skull like a physical blow. She thrashed against the chain, her body convulsing, the links clanking and straining as though they could barely contain her. Her hands clawed at the air, reaching for him, fingers twisted and bloody as though she had torn at the walls for hours, days, maybe even years, in an attempt to escape. Liam staggered back, his mind reeling, but he forced himself to keep the flashlight steady, hoping its light would somehow pacify her. For a moment it seemed to work. She stopped thrashing, her body going still as her hollow eyes fixed on the light. Her breathing slowed, her head tilting slightly as if in curiosity, and for a brief moment he felt a flicker of hope that he might somehow communicate with her, that there might be a way to free her spirit. But then her expression twisted, and a feral rage returned to her face. With a sudden violent movement she tore at the chain, her scream rising to an unearthly wail that shook the very walls. The links snapped, one by one, each break sending a tremor through the floor beneath him. Liam realized far too late what would happen next. The chain wasn't there to imprison her, it was there to contain her. As the last link broke, she lunged forward, her face contorted with anger and despair, her hands reaching out as though to drag him into whatever hell she had endured. He turned and ran, adrenaline surging through him as he sprinted down the narrow corridor, her screams echoing behind him, filling the air with a bone-chilling malice. His flashlight flickered, casting erratic shadows along the walls as he fled, the sensation of her presence close behind him, clawing at his heels. Every corner he turned seemed to lead to another dead end, the basement twisting and shifting as though it were alive, conspiring against him. His breaths came in short gasps, his mind racing with fear and regret. He could feel her, the girl's cold presence like a weight pressing down on him, growing closer with each step. Finally he saw a sliver of light ahead, a narrow set of stairs leading up, a faint hope of escape. He pushed himself harder, every muscle screaming in protest, his only thought to reach that staircase, to break free from the nightmare closing in around him. But just as he reached the stairs he felt a cold, claw-like grip on his shoulder. Her fingers, icy and unyielding, clamped down, pulling him back with a strength that belied her frail appearance. He stumbled, falling to the ground, his flashlight slipping from his grasp and rolling away, casting erratic shadows across the walls. He turned to face her, his mind a blur of terror and despair as she loomed over him, her face inches from his own, her breath a foul, freezing wind. Her mouth twisted into a grotesque smile, and she whispered something in a language he couldn't understand, her voice a raspy, otherworldly hiss. But just as he thought he was lost, the faintest ray of dawn's light filtered down from somewhere above, illuminating the room. The girl's face contorted in agony, and with a final, blood-curdling scream, she vanished, her form dissolving into a wisp of smoke that disappeared into the shadows. The house fell silent, the air still once more. Shaken, Liam dragged himself to his feet, his body trembling as he made his way up the stairs and out of the house, the dawn casting long shadows over the abandoned estate behind him. He didn't look back, his only thought to put as much distance as possible between himself and the house that had very nearly claimed him. As he stumbled away, the old woman's words echoed in his mind, a haunting reminder of the horrors he had barely escaped. Some mysteries aren't meant to be solved,